The diversity of humankind extends far beyond definitions of race and nationality. There are more than 370 million indigenous peoples belonging to more than 5,000 groups, each further distinguished by culture, tradition, and often nuances of appearance. Each indigenous group is recognized as such because of its origin from the first peoples to inhabit its geographic area. How much do we know about indigenous peoples? How well do we understand who they are? And how have stamps contributed to our knowledge? On September 13, 2007, the United Nations General Assembly adopted the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This act brought to fruition more than 20 years of discussion within the UN involving nations and indigenous groups. The Declaration sets a framework for peace and justice based upon mutual recognition and respect, and highlights the importance of the diversity and richness of civilizations and cultures which constitute the common heritage of humankind. Let's begin our philatelic exploration. Our so-called knowledge of indigenous peoples is most likely to be a passing familiarity with the handicrafts that help define them. We collect these objects or see them in museums, and they lend themselves to strikingly beautiful stamp images. Other important aspects, including clothing and ceremonial objects, are no less collected, admired, and featured on stamps. Nonetheless, figural art, masks, distinctive clothing are most likely to be, in our minds, disembodied from the people who created and used these and to whose cultures they were integral. An examination of actual indigenous peoples on stamps begins with the earliest depictions of monarchs of independent Pacific islands, including King Kamehameha III of Hawaii in 1853. Subsequently, stamps depicted Laupepa, the Malietoa or King of Samoa, and King George I of Tonga. But note that these images, although of indigenous people, all exhibit westernized dress. Other 19th century stamps occasionally depicted generalized images of indigenous peoples. The first to show a person of African origin is the Diego Suarez stamp with a profile of what may have been a Malagasy. The elaborately designed United States newspaper stamp is described as depicting an Indian maiden. This is perhaps the first stamp to show an indigenous person in traditional dress, although tribal affiliation is not indicated. Among the United States postage stamps, the first possibly showing indigenous people is the 1869 stamp depicting the landing of Columbus based upon the painting by John Vanderlyn. His work shows Arawak people in the imaginative forest at the right and what appear to be two kneeling individuals at the left, but these are either cropped or indistinguishable in the stamp image. The subsequent use of a design based upon the same painting for the 2-cent Columbian Exposition commemorative in 1892 includes the faint image of at least one Arawak at the far right. Although Vanderlyn's painting portrayed little detail of the Arawaks, the later work, Columbus Presenting Natives by Luigi Gregori, showed several Arawaks whom Columbus had taken back to the Spanish court. Their appearance, or at least that of their headdresses, is consistent with early published images of Arawaks. Seth Eastman's painting, Buffalo Chase, the basis for the 4-cent Trans-Mississippian stamp, accurately shows North American Plains Indians, but lacks information about tribal affiliation. The first identified Native American on a United States stamp was the Senecomica Princess Pocahontas. She married English explorer John Rolfe, who took her to England, where Simon van de Pas completed the only known contemporary portrait 1 year before her death. Considered by many to be among the most beautiful United States stamps, the 14-cent value of the 1922 issue depicts an American Indian. But here the actual subject is a historically known leader in traditional costume, Chief Hollow-Horned Bear of the Brule Sioux. He is simply not recognized as such on the stamp inscription. Beyond the United States, stamp images of indigenous peoples are found on issues of European colonies from the late 19th century through the middle 20th century and sometimes later. The earliest of these are the 1893 and 1894 issues of the French Red Sea port of Obock. The beautiful triangle stamps feature images that leave the impression of having been taken directly from photographs of Somali tribespeople. Although lacking in fine detail, the 1894 Obock stamps show a candid-appearing group of Somalis, and the stunning image has a very photographic feeling, embodying facial expressions and postures that connote genuine social interaction. It may be considered the best early contemporary depiction of an indigenous group. Into the early 20th century, colonial stamps increasingly depicted images of their indigenous habitants and their lifestyles. These included other photographic-like scenes, although those of French colonies, such as the marketplace in Dakar, Senegal, portray the greatest sense of realism. The depiction of faces is relatively rare into the mid-20th century, except in French colonial stamps, and identification of tribal affiliations such as the Maori of New Zealand or the Dayak of Borneo is often lacking. Nonetheless, whether the distinctive aspect is the texture of hair, facial features, tattoos, or head coverings, these stamps all show one or more features that would characterize an indigenous group. Indigenous groups typically have cultural traditions that contribute to their identity. Depictions of dance, ceremonial and daily attire, and music are important reflections of group identity and cohesion. Even when the group is not identified, the image reflects a group's culture and has the ability to emotionally transport the viewer to that place, time, and performance. Other stamps showing work by people typically focus on agricultural products such as cocoa and rubber, or the creation of goods such as textiles. These may be specific to a particular locale, and when they are, they reflect the influence of climate, flora, and fauna on the defining characteristics of an indigenous group. Similarly, activities such as hunting may depict other aspects of people in addition to the act of hunting. The geography of indigenous groups dictates much about them and the physical limits of their existence. Forms of transportation may be particular to a group, and island, coastal, or inland desert environments define the limits of movement in and about their native land. With more than 5,000 indigenous groups, including distinct tribes within former colonies, depictions on stamps of indigenous peoples and their cultures has been little changed through the late 20th century. The 2007 United Nations Declaration has brought new attention to indigenous peoples of the world, and in 2009 the UN Postal Administration issued the first series of stamps depicting indigenous people. These dramatic and engaging photos, with their splashes of color by designing artist Stephen Bennett, highlight just a small part of the incredible human diversity about which most of us know so little. The 2010 United Nations Indigenous Peoples stamps continued the beautiful artistic renderings of Bennett. They draw the viewer's attention to this diversity of facial features, hairstyles, and adornment, which are only a small part of the many physical and cultural aspects that define each group. Most recently, Bangladesh recognized its 5 most populous indigenous groups with stamps featuring 4 images representing each group. Showing facial features, attire, work, and cultural events, it is the most comprehensive portrayal of indigenous peoples by any country. The indication at the bottom of the sheet that this is the first phase holds promise for subsequent important issues like this. We live in an ever-increasingly complex world, and the people and cultures of indigenous groups are at risk for homogenization, as implied by Thomas Friedman's book, The World is Flat, A Brief History of the 21st Century. Although some groups are populous and robust, others are small and fragile, and the extinction of the Bow tribe of the Andaman Islands in 2010 heralded the loss of a culture and language. But there is cause to celebrate, and a need to help to preserve this fragile diversity. Greater recognition and understanding of cultures, especially those of indigenous peoples, gives each of us a way to better enjoy and appreciate the beauty of humankind.